Caution is something not often explored in the world of martial arts. You might be looking at me like, wow, you're a dickhead. They're fighting. Of course, I would hope they defend themselves. I mean, shit, if I had that big Brazilian that just grunts all the time across from me, I would hope I'd keep my fucking hands up. However, fighting's not that simple. Different rule sets allow for different forms of offense and thereby different degrees of caution each competitor has to take, with some forms of defense not being very applicable as you add more striking weapons or you add a grappling component to particular competitions. So in this video, we're going to explore each of those intricacies in depth. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be breaking down the martial arts. I'm going to be exploring into three different categories: striking, grappling, and MMA. First up in the striking department, in what seems to be the genesis of all striking, we have boxing. Boxing is a sport where competitors put on gloves and they are only allowed to punch. And the fight goes on for however many rounds the bout is. And they compete until someone gets knocked out or referee stoppage, corner stoppage, or a end of the fight where a decision is made afterwards by the judges. Because there's no threat of an elbow, knee, a kick, or any grappling threat. Boxers generally gravitate towards a stance that makes them less susceptible to being punched. They call it this almost a skateboard stance, where they leave their front leg very exposed in order to try to make themselves into a smaller target. In addition to the stance, another component that's worth noting is some of the defensive tactics, such as some of the head movement. I mean, we see head movement in other martial arts competitions. However, we never see head movement as exaggerated as we see it in boxing. Boxers can dip their heads into below the hip level, which generally wouldn't be safe if you allow things like a knee up the middle, for example. Boxing does display some of the most beautiful forms of offense and defense, but some of these defensive tactics and the stance leaves you very susceptible as we start exploring more striking weapons and a grappling threat. Next up in the striking department, we have kickboxing. Is very similar to boxing in all the ways the fight can get stopped, but the very stark difference between the two is the fact, as the name implies, you're allowed to kick now and you're also allowed to knee. There is no clinch component or grappling component, as clinches are broken up in the same manner as a boxing fight. The stance changes completely, as now there's a big threat of leg kicks. I swear to God, you leave your leg exposed with one of these kickboxing motherfuckers, you will not walk again. Very heavy slips and rolls below hip level and past the shoulder level will not be generally safe, because the consequences of going that low may be with you in the shadow realm. And just like boxing, there's no concern of the fight going to the ground or a grappling component, as clinches are broken up. So in case you didn't get enough with kicks, punches, and knees, we now have Muay Thai, the art of the eight limbs. And as the name implies, you now have elbows added into the mix. Unlike boxing and kickboxing, clinches here are not broken up immediately. You're allowed to fight in them. You're allowed to knee, elbow, and even dump your opponents in the clinch. Muay Thai clinching almost turns into a pseudo grappling match, as you're kneeing and you're elbowing, you're also checking your opponent's weight to see if you have a dump. Muay Thai fighters, just like kickboxers, cannot keep a stance like a boxer would, where they keep that front leg very exposed. Muay Thai, in its most traditional form, keeps a very square stance, and because there's no threat of a hip throw and there's no threat of a grappling component, they're allowed to keep this square stance. That's why, although Thailand produces some of the most complete strikers in the world, it's a very difficult transition into MMA, because the threat of a takedown drastically changes how you have to keep your stance. But in case you don't believe me, here's a professional fighter talking about it.
The reason you don't see as many Thai fighters either is because of the stance. The stance doesn't cross over well
Why?
because it just invites takedowns.
In the grappling department, probably the most important aspect of MMA, or rather the martial art that makes the most champions, is wrestling. And wrestling, the fight starts standing up, and competitors are trying to prevent their opponent from pinning them, which means both shoulder blades are down against the mat. Wrestlers are completely notorious for their forward pressure. I mean, it may be something in the water, or it may be due to that fucking conditioning. I mean, has anyone watched one of those videos? Obviously, striking is illegal in this grappling art, and since they are illegal and there's no concern for them, competitors generally keep a very low stance. That can be done due to the fact that there's no knees coming up the middle or any strikes. Also, as they get into these very heavy scrambles with each other, they don't have to be concerned about submissions either. So it's this game of trying to press forward and be positionally dominant and get the pin on your opponent. And now on to wrestling's more popular cousin. Next in the grappling department, we have jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu competitions and jiu-jitsu roles, gi or no gi, generally begin just like wrestling, although in a gi there can be a judo component to it. However, where this martial art shines and truly differentiates itself is once the fight gets to the ground. Unlike wrestling, where the point has been earned as soon as you get a pin. When the fight gets to the ground, that is when the jiu-jitsu fight generally begins. You are trying to get into positions where you can submit your opponent, which of course means you either are snapping something or choking someone unconscious. Within scrambles, jiu-jitsu competitors and practitioners have to be mindful where their arms are at, whether they're leaving their legs exposed, whether their weight is being distributed in a bad manner where they can get swept. So many components. As we touched on earlier, because there's now a threat of a submission, it makes competitors have to think a lot more when they scramble with each other. I mean, you have to think about what position you're in and what's in danger currently. Also, not worrying about striking generally allows for a lower stance and allows for particular techniques to be employed. There are particular sweeps where you can get into positions for leg locks that would not be generally safe if striking were to be allowed. I mean, shit, I dare anyone to do an X sweep in MMA. I mean, it might not turn out too well. Next up in the grappling department, we have judo. Judo, alongside jiu-jitsu, is done in a gi, although I would think the more popular application in jiu-jitsu is no gi, but that's a conversation for another day. Judo is mainly concerned with getting your opponent to the ground via foot sweep or throw as technically sound as you can. You, of course, can employ these foot sweeps and throws inside of jiu-jitsu and employ them inside of a wrestling match, but where the competition really changes, there's no concern of double leg takedowns, strikes coming back in your direction, any sort of submissions that can try to be acquired as you're trying to acquire grips and focus on each other's balance. So it allows for this pure focus on acquiring grips and being as technically sound as you can as you try to get your opponent to the ground. And to top off this exploration of martial arts, we ended with MMA. And what originally began as a way to see which martial art was superior transformed into something completely different. MMA, as it is today, truly embodies Bruce Lee's quote, "Be like water." Because you can't put a style to half of these motherfuckers sometimes. They know how to kickbox, they know how to wrestle, they know their jujitsu. MMA, as the name implies, is a blending of the martial arts, barring techniques found in like Wing Chun where you can poke people in the eye. I mean, John Jones might have something to say about that, but all of the particular dangers we've discussed are all found in MMA. In today's MMA, fighters now have to be competent in all of these areas. In your grappling, in your wrestling, in your striking, you must be at the very minimum competent. How this rule set changed everything is you cannot be overly concerned with one aspect of the game. You cannot just be a good kickboxer. You cannot just be a good Muay Thai fighter. You cannot just be a good jiu-jitsu player. The rules are no longer protecting you from certain aspects of fighting. So you must be adept at handling all these dangers. I mean, barring the eye pokes. Shout out John Jones.
Pop off like they Henny bottles. We love not to leave a drop off. Like some praising will leave me in amazement if it just happens at the motherfucking top floor.